Inflated profits, clients that didn't exist, a CEO in prison, the collapse of Wirecard is probably the biggest financial scandal in Germany's post-war history. The story of Wirecard is a story of greed, ignorance, and also regulatory failure. And we have now with us the man who uncovered it all. And it's my really great pleasure to introduce Dan McCrum from the Financial Times to this session. Hi, Dan.
Hello, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for showing up. Dan is a member of the Financial Times investigation team, and he has been with the FT for more than a decade. And we're going to talk about Wirecard. My first question would be, Dan, to you. How did you get interested in the Wirecard story?
So it actually happened 6 years ago. I was interested in companies which have problems with their accounts. And I was approached by a hedge fund manager called Leo Perry. And he had been taking a look at what was then this obscure German payments company I'd never heard of, Wirecard. And what he laid out to me was essentially that the numbers didn't make sense. And it had bought all of these businesses across Asia. But when you took a close look at them, certainly in the paperwork he'd been able to find, it was nothing like what the story that the company had been telling to its shareholders. And that really sparked my interest because there were a whole bunch of small things which really said the numbers don't add up and maybe something wrong is going on here.
Now, I assume many people, call you or meet you and tell you about this or that company where something is not going wrong. How do you decide which project is really worth looking into?
Well, you start to get a feel for these things, and it also depends on what evidence you can find and what work you're going to have to do. And at the Financial Times, certainly when we're dealing with people like hedge funds, where you know that they have an interest in a certain outcome, which in this case is the share price going down, then you have to be able to at least recreate all the work that they give you. And then you want to be able to do some reporting yourself. So in this case, I went to Bahrain looking for a customer of Wirecard, and it became clear very quickly that something wasn't right. The customer didn't really exist, or it had been making up its business. It had been lying in various press releases and things like that. And so that gives you a thread which you start to pull on, and you think, okay, yeah, I think we're onto something here.
So the trip to Bahrain was really the moment when you thought, okay, something is really odd here. I have to devote more time and energy into this.
Well, I literally told my boss at the time, Paul Murphy, I think I found the smoking gun. Now, obviously, this was 6 years ago, and there was quite a lot of things happened between now and then. So it wasn't quite as strong as I initially thought.
So you had the idea that something is wrong, but not that it will become that as big as it turned out to be. Is that?
Oh, I mean, one of the big surprising things was certainly if you talk to, Leo Perry and some of the other investors who looked at it, they thought it was very clear, and so did I. There was something clearly going wrong at the company. But what was really surprising was that I wrote a series of blog posts for the FT back in 2015. And I will admit that these were quite complicated. And because we didn't have proof, we had to frame them as questions. What sort of company is Wirecard? What is really going on inside it and with these numbers? But the regulators never seemed to pay attention. And what Wirecard did very effectively, right from the beginning with the Financial Times, and also whenever it encountered critics, was to say, well, this is really just speculators trying to do us down.
Right.
And it seemed to persuade the regulators at BaFin that it was the target of malicious speculators, and any critic of it was, it was baseless and just malicious speculation.
Let's talk about the regulators later. I'd just like to talk a little about the early stages of your research into Wirecard. Maybe you can tell us a little about how the sausage is made. So how do you work in the FT investigative team? Is it, do you have rooms that you cannot eavesdrop on? Do you have your contacts in the markets? How does it work?
So part of it is just the way that you operate in financial journalism, certainly at the Financial Times, which is, you always want to have two sources on something before you print it. You want to be able to recreate things yourself if someone gives them to you. You have to have a certain level of proof or confidence in what you're writing before you get there. And how you get there is different. I it's cultivating sources in the markets, or just, experts who you don't have to be an expert in every aspect of finance to be a financial journalist. You just have to know who to ask. And then in terms of the the investigations team. I mean, with Wirecard, because there was this history of hacking, of employing a whole range of sort of private detectives, there were various people attempting to spoof the journalists at the FT and others into giving up information or conducting research on us and our sources. So because of all of these things that were going on, we were extremely careful. So it's things like we never took phones into meetings in case they were hacked. I spent about 3 months working in a very small room, basically a bunker, on a computer which wasn't connected to the internet. And this was after we were approached by whistleblowers who turned out to be key to the story in late 2018.
Okay, so you took these precautions. Yeah, I read a piece you wrote in the FT about the Wirecard story where you're describing this one scene where you have lunch with Jan Marsalek, the CFO, who is now former CFO, who's now on the run. And then some of your colleagues actually at the FT are sitting on the table next to you and taping it all. Could you describe a little what was the significance of this episode?
So this is one of the strangest episodes which we encountered in the FT. And it was one of the things that really convinced us that we were dealing with a criminal organization here. And what happened, that editor I mentioned, Paul Murphy, he had been approached in about January 2018 by one of his old sort of market sources, a sort of businessman who likes to speculate on stocks and shares. And he was told that there was a bribe available to remove those blog posts I'd written earlier about Wirecard from the FT site. And the figure of $10 million was mentioned. And so this was the premise of the meeting that was set up. And the basis of it, he was told also that Jan Marsalek, Wirecard's chief operating officer, would just really like to meet him and set the record straight. And so that's why we went to this lunch at I couldn't be anywhere near it. It had to be my colleagues. And so Paul went to the lunch where Jan Marsalek showed up with some of these contacts and another man who didn't really explain why he was there. And part of our team, masquerading as sort of ladies who lunch, had a camera hidden in the handbag to capture the whole thing on tape. Because we weren't sure, was this really an offer of a bribe, or was this some sort of trap which Wirecard wanted to use to show that actually FT journalists were corrupt? But the thing is, certainly Jan Marsalek was sensible enough not to mention a bribe at the table if there ever was really a bribe available. So we couldn't write anything, but what it left us with was, again, like I said, this deep sense that this is not a normal company. You don't have a senior executive at a financial institution, making contact with journalists through these sort of clandestine market sources.
Yeah, you also described a little about the ways that Wirecard tried to intimidate you and other reporters. We have other reporters like the Zeit who were reporting on Wirecard and also intimidated, not to the degree I think you were. Could you describe how that worked? I mean, did people, wait in front of your flat, or how did you? What happened there?
I mean, well, the intimidation took many forms. I mean, it started with very expensive lawyers. I think most journalists who attempted to write about Wirecard over the years received some very threatening letters from their lawyers. And certainly when Wirecard actually sued us in Munich last year, it used one of the most feared corporate litigators in Germany. And then you had sort of the reputation aspects. The company would say you're wrong and you're corrupt. Marcus Braun told investors several times that I was working with speculators and they shouldn't pay attention to me. And then we had the surveillance. We became aware that there was this extensive physical surveillance operation, which appeared to be targeted at me and my colleagues, and also a whole range of people who Wirecard suspected we were in cahoots with, hedge fund managers, speculators in London. And I think there were 28 different private detectives following people around in London at that point.
Yeah, and how did that convince you more that something is fishy, or did you at least in this time, or were you afraid and you thought, I better leave it to someone else?
I mean, we were pretty convinced by that point that the company was criminal. And I mean, at one level, it was deeply intimidating. I mean, you do start to wonder, are you being followed? You start to take we were already paranoid about security. And I was doing all sorts of things like you would, when I was going to a meeting, I would, when the train arrived, I would wait until the last moment, then jump out just before the doors closed, look around, seeing I've been followed. It's probably ludicrous, but this is the sort of paranoia that starts to set in. But at the other hand, there was also this element in which a lot of their measures were just genuinely incompetent. Like, we found out about the whole surveillance operation and these 28 private detectives. So yeah, it was just an incredibly strange time throughout.
How difficult was it for you to, so you're working on this story, how difficult was it for you to convince your editorial team, the editor-in-chief, everyone at the FT, that actually you're the good guy and they're the bad guys and it's not the other way around?
I mean, I faced investigations at 2 different times from the FT based on these allegations from Wirecard that I was corrupt and in cahoots with hedge fund managers. And each time there never was anything to it. And when they looked into it, they found there was never anything to it. But those were, it's quite a stressful time to be facing those sorts of challenges. And it makes the reporting that you're doing much harder. And I think and we're going to come to the regulators, but also that moment when I found out I was under criminal investigation by the German authorities, I mean, you do start to think the world has gone mad. And that certainly not, I always knew I was innocent, but I did start to doubt that all this work I put in would ever come to anything.
If you had to describe, what basically the things that didn't add up in Wirecard's business model were, how would you do that? So why did they go down in the end? So,
and this is one of those things. I mean, I could talk in endless detail. So I'll give a high level answer first. And I mentioned it before. The numbers didn't add up. So it was things like the cash flow. So Wirecard was very profitable for a very long time, but it never had particularly good cash flow. And that was strange because it was growing very quickly. And as we understand the nature of a payments processor business, as it grows, it should just naturally have more money coming in. Its working capital improves. And that wasn't happening. And I think the thing to understand about Wirecard, so it collapsed this year with this 1.9 billion euro hole. But you don't start out faking 1.9 billion euros. You start out faking a small amount of profits. And I think this happened at least a decade ago, that the profit started to be faked. But this leaves you with a problem, because you then have this hole to fill. The cash should be there and it isn't. And then the next year you have an even bigger hole because you want your profits to get bigger. So you're looking like you're growing, but then you've still got to fill in last year's hole plus this new bigger hole that you've dug this year. And it sort of, I guess, to switch metaphor, like the hole gets much bigger, or the problem starts to snowball. And what they did very effectively in 2015 was they came up with this structure which allowed them to say that they didn't have the cash in their bank accounts. The cash was being held by a trustee, and they were doing all sorts of business through third parties. And I think this is one of the key points to realize. Why was Wirecard not exposed for so long? And I think you can ask questions, not just about the regulators, but the investors who willingly backed this. They should have asked to understand properly, where was Wirecard making its money? And one of the accusations which was thrown at Wirecard over the years was that it was involved, if not in money laundering necessarily, then it was operating in sort of grey, shady parts of the internet. It was processing money for gamblers, maybe in contravention of US regulations. It was processing lots of money for porn, all sorts of scams on the internet. And I think what a lot of investors felt was, well, this is a grey area. Regulators don't seem to care. And, stuff like gambling, people want to gamble. So why should we worry? So they effectively gave Wirecard a pass. They sort of said, well, it doesn't want to talk about its business too much because it doesn't want to shine a light on where it's making all its profit. And that allowed Wirecard to get away with faking essentially half of its business and all of its profits.
So the 1.9 billion actually never existed, right?
No, that never existed.
They're not hidden somewhere, they're not there.
No, I mean, let's be clear, it seems like the company was thoroughly looted. There was about €1 billion of loans which went out mostly in the last year after we started reporting, which were essentially money given to these partners of Wirecard, which didn't really exist, or certainly weren't doing the business that Wirecard claimed. So huge amounts of money were stolen, but I don't think any of this 1.9 billion euros ever existed.
So the money that was stolen is still around. That someone has it, but we don't know.
I imagine Jan Marsalek, who has disappeared, has a significant amount of money.
Yeah. Do you have any clues where he could be?
So I think Süddeutsche has done some terrific work on this, pointing to Belarus as where he fled. The day after, I think, Wirecard announced this 1.9 billion euros was missing. And it still boggles my mind that that could happen and Jan Marsalek could be wandering around free and nobody thought that they could arrest him.
Yeah.
So why Jan Marsalek was allowed to leave the country still, I find baffling.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Germany, because it was a German company. Germany was proud about this company. It was in the DAX 30 share index. So as you mentioned, at some point, the regulators woke up and then they started to investigate not Wirecard, but you. How did you learn about this and how did you feel?
So I learned about this when it was leaked to the German press. I think it was Der Spiegel had the story. And like I said, it seemed like the world had gone mad, because you have to remember at this point, we had published a series of articles which seemed to show that a DAX 30 company had serious problems in its Asian headquarters, and it had these partners in the Philippines, which didn't really seem to exist. And that would, you think, raise serious questions. And we had no visibility into whether the German authorities were also investigating those claims, but it was startling that they seemed to think that I would take the biggest story of my career and leak it to some hedge funds to make some money on it. And all the evidence for that was ginned up by Wirecard. It was a total fabrication.
And then you learned they investigated you. And did anyone out of the German regulatory establishment, from the German regulatory establishment, did they ever reach out to you and ask you about, what do you know about this company? Do you have any, insights you could share with us? Can you send us your articles? Did that ever happen?
No, it didn't. I mean, I think Wirecard has made it difficult for the authorities to do that by, once you've launched a criminal investigation into someone, it's very hard to then turn around and say, oh, could we have your help? But no, the authorities didn't seek more information from us, certainly officially, and they didn't seem. They don't appear to have understood how the journalism process worked, particularly around the publication of the articles in question, which we were accused of leaking. And certainly in the evidence that was presented to me, they didn't appear to have tried to find out.
So they just believed in the story that you were collaborating with hedge funds to bring down Wirecard.
I mean, it was more than that. I mean, Baffin lacking evidence beyond this unsigned witness statement, which was presented by Wirecard, that someone knew the story was coming. The rest of it was just a whole load of supposition. I might have been publishing stories in the way that we publish them to further the interest of speculators. I had the opportunity to talk to people and tell them. I mean, it was pure speculation.
Yeah. But why did you? What is your explanation for this? I mean, do you think that they were all intimidated by Wirecard themselves? They were afraid of the FT. They were suspicious that, the Anglo-Saxon Financial Times is going to destroy German financial actors. How do you make sense of this?
I mean, I think there's a few different things. One appears to be a culture of deference towards senior executives. You have robust interrogation of what politicians say and the expectation that they're lying and they're serving their own interests. But then when it comes to reporting on companies, you don't seem to have that same level of mistrust or refusing to take things at face value.
Or rigor.
Yeah. And you also have, I think, there was this, Wirecard played into this, but there was this sense that of Anglo-Saxons attacking a German company. My understanding is that Wirecard was seen as this sort of future technological hope, a tech company for Germany, which has a lot of great manufacturers. And so people had invested a lot of hope in Wirecard. And so it became very hard to accept the idea that it was a total fraud. And I think also you have these other aspects, these gatekeepers, which play into it. So Wirecard would always point to the work by its auditors, Ernst & Young, and it would point to, the array of sort of lawyers and other professional services who worked with it, the banks, and say, look, these guys wouldn't work with us if we were a total fraud. So I think that played into it as well. But you could ask a wider question, does Germany sort of have trouble seeing companies doing very bad things as criminals?
Yeah, it probably has also to do with the German corporate culture, which is not the arm's length sort of Anglo-Saxon culture, stock market based, but it's more like everyone knows everyone else, and you're closer. So maybe there's also a different spirit of corporate culture that plays a role. Do you think that there are lessons to be learned from Wirecard for journalists or also for regulators or the way the market works, the financial markets work?
I think some of the lessons are you have to ask questions until you get an answer. And that's as true as it is for journalists as it is for investors. So what investors should have done is said, well, do we really understand Wirecard's business model? When we don't get an answer to a question, why is that? And there's a well-known short seller called Mark Cahodas. And he has this expression, there is never one cockroach in the kitchen. So if you find a company is lying about one thing, that probably isn't the only thing that it's going to be lying about. And I think this comes back to in terms of journalism. Well, investigative journalism is just like normal journalism, except you have a bit more luxury of time. And what we really kept doing again and again, both with those original reporting that I did 6 years ago and more recently, was this doesn't look right. What's the answer? That answer doesn't make sense. Can we have a better one? And you have to keep doing that, I think.
What puzzles me up is on this Wirecard thing is really the stock market. So you had your reports, you had these short sellers who also produced reports, and they were more or less published. If you wanted to get them, you could get them. So why is it that still solid German banks and pension funds poured money into Wirecard, bought Wirecard stock? We were taught. I was taught at my university that markets are more or less efficient, financial markets. But how come that they can overlook such a massive scandal?
So again, I think one of the lessons is you do need to listen to these critical voices. You have to understand that short sellers have an interest and they want to make money by the share price going down. But also, certainly if they're saying something in public, then each time they do that, they're risking their reputation. So it doesn't serve that reputation to just make stuff up. And again, even if they are saying something, then there should be a straightforward answer to it if it's not true, or a reasonable explanation. So the first step is just to listen, to take those questions seriously and not just dismiss it as, this rampant Anglo-Saxon speculation. And then, but I think the other aspect is sort of my my theory of how markets work is most people are sort of only doing as much work as they absolutely have to. You know, a lot of people are bluffing. And a lot of people are...
maybe also true for other areas.
Oh, well, yes. I mean, this is a general rule for life.
Yeah.
And so
please continue. Yeah.
And so if you're an investor, you're doing enough work to go, do I need to invest in this? And so as Wirecard, it could be as simple as saying, hey, I think online payments is a good area to be in. Wirecard does that. I'll invest. And you don't need to go into all the numbers and answer all these questions, because you say, hey, E and Y are there, and they're one of the world's biggest accounting firms, so they must have done the work. Or you look at the banks and say, well, you know, Credit Suisse wouldn't be helping sell a 900 million euro convertible bond with all these allegations of accounting fraud swirling around in the air if they hadn't done the work.
So everyone assumes that the other one is doing the work, and actually in the end, no one is doing it. Because that was so puzzling. I mean, you had, you know, when Wirecard knocked on the door of the German Chancellery and asking for help with the Chinese business, they, of course, there were your reports, but on the other hand, that's what people tell us. You had SoftBank investing, and so you would maybe, as you know, if you're finance minister or head of state, you assume, well, if SoftBank does an investment, it mustn't be a completely criminal company. There must be something to it. But actually, there wasn't. So SoftBank also probably didn't look into the numbers, maybe.
Yeah, and SoftBank was an extremely strange trade, which we could talk about in probably more depth than we need to. But that was a very strange trade in which SoftBank's staff appeared to be using the reputation of the company to do a personal trade, in which they then didn't actually retain any risk for themselves. They sold, they invested into Wirecard and then immediately sold it on to other investors. So
so they weren't really, they didn't have any skin in the game, actually. SoftBank as a company, only the staff, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And let's also talk about Commerzbank, with major German lender, and they were recommending the Wirecard stock until almost the end. Did they talk to you? Did they, I don't know, say sorry or something, or how did that go?
So what happened was we published our first big story on Wirecard on January 30, 2019. And Commerzbank's analyst, Heike Pauls, the next day put out a note calling this fake news from a serial offender, me. She effectively was saying I was a criminal and this was clearly nothing to it. And that was astounding because this was from Commerzbank, you know, the very respected investment bank. And Commerzbank withdrew the note quite quickly afterwards, and it apologized to the FT, if not to me personally. But actually I did, on the day that it came out, I thought the note was a hoax. So I called up Ms. Pauls and asked her, and she asked her why she'd written it. And all she would say is, well, if it walks like a duck, it probably is a duck. So I've never got a good answer to how she came to that opinion.
Okay. All right, great. That was really, really good. And I learned a lot. Of course, the question we all want to have an answer on is, what are you currently working on?
Well, I am working on a book on Wirecard, which should be out in Germany next year, I hope. And I am, of course, always interested in the next big story as well. So, I mean, if there are any more whistleblowers out there, please do get in touch.
All right. Great. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you very much.
Yep.